Assalamu alaikum YouTube. Welcome back again to our channel, Al-Mawrid Canada. And welcome from other sister organizations of Al-Mawrid as well. My name is Danish Hamid. I am a PhD in philosophy, and I'm here with a new course by one of our guests from before called Jamie Turner. He's very kindly agreed to engage with us in a course in philosophy which he titles Islamic Theism and Religious Epistemology. So let me just introduce Jamie Turner. Jamie Turner is a doctoral candidate in philosophy at the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Birmingham. We are also joined with by Ahmed, who is a medical student and has an interest in philosophy as well. So let me give a short introduction to our course. The course aims to introduce students of philosophy, theology, and Islam more generally to a contemporary philosophical overview of religious epistemology in the context of thinking about the Islamic theistic tradition. It does so by providing an accessible gateway into the philosophical discipline of epistemology in general and religious epistemology in particular. By drawing on key concepts within contemporary epistemology, the course aims to guide students through thinking about important epistemological ideas that relate to Islamic theistic belief. What that means, we'll hear from Jamie Turner himself in person. Over to you, Jamie, and welcome to Al-Mawrid Canada.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be among you guys. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. So thanks for reading out that course description, Danish. So essentially the course that I'm attempting to present to you guys over the next few weeks is, as you say, Islamic theism and religious epistemology. So in essence, the course aims to look at the Islamic theistic tradition through the lens of contemporary epistemology. So we can look at our Islamic theistic tradition historically, politically, theologically, jurisprudentially. There are various different ways of looking at the tradition and analyzing it. And one of those ways is to look at it epistemically or epistemologically. Throughout the course of today's lecture, I want to basically run through a sort of simple and brief overview of what epistemology is and some of the important epistemic concepts that are going to be useful for us as we proceed through this course and we look at the Islamic tradition from an epistemological point of view. So that's basically the session today or the lecture today, and that's the course in general. So the overview of this lecture is to look at knowledge. What do we mean by knowledge? Because epistemology, of course, is, as I'm going to say in a moment, the study of knowledge. So what is knowledge? What's the nature of knowledge? What are the sources of knowledge? How can we obtain or acquire knowledge? That's the first part of the lecture. The second part concerns something called positive epistemic status, which I'm not going to define for the moment. And then the third part is about the nature of evidence and the different kinds or types of evidence that might be relevant epistemically in some sense. So that's the overview. So what is epistemology in general? As I said, epistemology literally means the study of knowledge. Episteme is a Greek word which means knowledge, and ology is the study of it. So in essence, epistemology is the study of knowledge. It's sometimes called the theory of knowledge as well. And traditionally, the sort of main aspect or element of epistemology is to think about this question of knowledge. So what does knowledge consist of? What conditions need to obtain for a person to acquire it? So that's essentially the analysis of knowledge, looking at the concepts and breaking it down. Another traditional component is looking at the different routes or ways in which we can acquire that thing that we call knowledge. But there are also other important aspects that are related as well in epistemology. So there are other concepts like justification and rationality. These epistemic concepts come into play when we start to think about whether it's possible not necessarily to possess knowledge, but maybe to believe something in it reasonably, to have reasonable belief or justified belief or rational belief. And how does that connect up to knowledge and acquiring it? There are other important concepts, as I said, evidence, because sometimes it's thought that having evidence is a really important aspect of having knowledge. So that's relevant. And then some other things like defeaters, which are things which take away our knowledge. And this distinction here, as I've mentioned, internalism, externalism, we'll get to. So epistemology in general is the study or theory of knowledge and its related concepts. But I want to draw your attention quickly to that table on the right-hand side. This is an important distinction that we should just get out of the way. There is a difference, of course, between ontology and epistemology. So ontology asks questions concerning what is, whether something obtains or exists or not, right? But epistemology is not asking what exists, but it's primarily asking how we know, say, that something exists, right? So in the context of religious epistemology, an ontological question would be, does God exist? And then we provide an affirmative or negative ontological answer. Yes, God does indeed exist. An epistemological question would be, can we know that God exists? Is it possible to know that God exists? Another one would be, how can we know that God exists? And epistemology tries to answer those questions. And throughout this course, we'll be looking at the Islamic theistic tradition to try and see what different elements and trends within the Islamic tradition say about how we can know God exists, or whether we can know that God exists. So that distinction is important just to get out there, particularly because there are some, in certain contexts, it's confused, and I can maybe give an example a little bit later. All right. So yes, Danish.
Yeah, Jamie, could you say more about sources of knowledge and what exactly they might be, or could you enumerate?
Definitely. That is a slide. I have a dedicated slide to it, Danish. Do not worry, sir. Do not worry. All right. So part one, knowledge, the nature of knowledge, and Danish, its sources. All right. So traditionally, knowledge has been defined as JTB. JTB meaning justified true belief, right? And this goes all the way back to Plato in a famous Platonic dialogue. Plato is suggested to have stipulated this as the definition of what knowledge is. In contemporary epistemology, nobody thinks that this is what knowledge is anymore, but it's helpful for us to think about this account of knowledge so that we can get a grasp as to what extra might be needed in explicating the nature of knowledge. And this, as we're going to see, is particularly relevant to what's necessary to acquire religious knowledge. So JTB, we can break it down: belief, truth, and justification. So why think that belief is a necessary condition or necessary component of knowledge? Is it possible for somebody to know something without believing it? Well, it seems implausible. So first of all, what do we mean by belief? Belief is basically just to uphold some proposition as being true. Belief is called a propositional attitude. It's an attitude you take towards a proposition. What's a proposition? Well, something like that there is a laptop on my desk, that I am in a bedroom, that I have a glass of water. And a belief is just an attitude you take towards those propositions. You affirm them, you accept them, you hold them up to be true. So is belief a necessary component of knowledge? Well, it seems so. Suppose we have a case of a teacher with a group of students in class, and the teacher's reading out the results of a test or a quiz that the students recently gave. And the teacher says that the correct answer to question 5 was B, for instance, out of A, B, C, D, B. And the student says, oh, yes, I knew that. But it turned out that actually the student, during the time that they were given this test, clearly didn't know that, because they didn't even believe that was the right answer. They put A or they put D. It's hardly plausible for us to think that that student knew the answer if they didn't even believe it at the time. So it's generally accepted by philosophers today and across time, I'd say, that belief is a necessary component of knowledge, at least I don't want to complicate it, but propositional knowledge of certain propositions. What about truth? Is truth a necessary condition? Well, consider an example. Suppose somebody has a belief, and that belief is that there is a cup on their desk, and it turns out there isn't a cup on their desk. Could we reasonably say that they know that there is a cup on their desk when there isn't in fact a cup on their desk? That doesn't seem plausible. One of the reasons is because what we're doing when we say somebody knows something is we are crediting them for acquiring a kind of success, that there's something that they've done right, such that we credit them with knowledge. And clearly, when they assert a proposition that's not true, they seem to be going wrong somewhere. So they haven't acquired the success or achieved the success of knowledge when they've made an incorrect judgment or something. So it's basically standard that every philosopher will tell you that knowledge consists of belief and truth. That's just clear. But then, okay, we've got belief and we've got truth. Could that be sufficient? Suppose I'm a big football fan, right? I'm a big Liverpool fan. I hate Manchester United. So suppose Manchester United are playing in a football match against a side in one of the lower leagues, say Accrington Stanley, a really poor and low team in Britain, and somebody says, you know what, I know, or they say that they believe that Manchester United are going to lose 5-0 to this team that are significantly worse on paper than Manchester United. And suppose they play, and it turns out after the match that Accrington really did beat Manchester United 5-0. Okay, so they had a belief that Man United are going to lose 5-0. And it turned out to be true, right? So they fulfilled those two conditions, belief and truth. But would we say that they actually possessed knowledge of the fact that Manchester United were going to lose? Well, it doesn't seem so, because they were just lucky. I mean, on paper, all the evidence suggests that Manchester United were going to easily win. So the fact that they ended up losing was a matter of luck, we might say, or the person who possesses that belief, they happen to have a true belief just by way of luck. So traditionally, philosophers have said what's missing in cases like this is justification, that the relevant person didn't have any sufficient grounds or justification for believing that Manchester United were going to lose. It was just lucky. They just got lucky. Suppose, on the other hand, that I believe that if we look at the picture of the clock, that suppose, whatever time that is, 10 to 12 or something, or is it 10 o'clock? I can't tell. Suppose that somebody believes that it's 10 to 12 or 10 o'clock, and they have that belief, and it's true that it really is 10 to 12 or 12 o'clock or 10 o'clock. And they have some basis for it. They have some evidence. What's the evidence? Well, their perception of it. They see the clock, right? That's their evidence. So they have some justification. They've got belief. They've got truth. All right, they know the time. So that's the traditional account of knowledge. Now, contemporary epistemologists have said, actually, though, that's not sufficient. It could still be the case that somebody has a belief that's true and has justification, and yet still not have knowledge. So this is sometimes known as the Gettier problem, because Edmund Gettier in the 1960s, I think 67, basically wrote a really short paper, like 2 or 3 pages, and it turns out to be one of the most influential pieces of philosophy, like in the modern era, in the modern period. So basically, Edmund Gettier gave some examples where there is belief, truth, and justification, and yet not knowledge. Now, before Gettier, Bertrand Russell gave an example, but he didn't really connect. He didn't connect the dots. But Russell's example was of a clock, which suppose you have an appointment at the dentist. You arrive at the dentist, you're booked in for 3 o'clock, and you don't have your watch on you. You want to know what time it is. You want to know that you've arrived on time. You look at the clock. You see, oh, it's 3 o'clock. So you're on time because your appointment's at 3:15. It's good. Right, you have a belief, let's say, that it's 3 o'clock. It's true, it really is 3 o'clock. You have justification. You've seen the clock. But let's say, lo and behold, that clock had stopped and it was broken and it had not been functioning for like several months, and it's just been fixed on 3 o'clock. Well, can we plausibly say that that person possesses knowledge? Most philosophers would say no, it was just a matter of luck that the hands happened to co-align at 3 o'clock in that sense. So the lesson is that justification, belief in truth is not sufficient. These conditions might be necessary for knowledge, but they are not taken together sufficient. So lesson, what's the lesson? The lesson is, as I put here, whatever the conditions of knowledge are, they must be such that the fulfillment of those conditions guarantee that one's belief is true. It can't be true just by way of luck. So what epistemologists have been trying to do is trying to flesh out the conditions of knowledge such that when they are fulfilled, the fulfillment of them in some sense guarantees and makes sure that your belief is true. Because notice in this example with the clock, it was just lucky, right, that the individual had a true belief. We want it to be the case that it's not a matter of luck that someone gets a true belief, but that they do something that guarantees them a true belief. And then we can say that they know. Now, in contemporary epistemology, a lot of time has been spent trying to flesh out new and improved accounts of knowledge, and to try and, solve the Gettier problem, essentially. I raised this point because, and I alluded to it earlier, that it's going to be important for us because when we come to think about, say, knowledge of God or knowledge of Islam, one potential problem that might come up is that we have a belief that's true and justified, but the level of justification might not be such that we can know. That's the problem, that we can know God or that we can know Islam. Obviously, I don't think that, but we need an account of knowledge, religious knowledge, that makes sure that when we fulfill the conditions, we can know God and we can know Islam, right? Or at least we want to try and attempt to get there. I think we can get there. Now, here are just a couple of examples, and I'm not going to go into the depths here, but here are just a couple of examples of how epistemologists have tried to solve the Gettier problem. So one view of knowledge is basically called reliabilism, or the reliabilist view, or the reliabilist account. This account basically says S, being some subject, some individual, knows that P, that some proposition is true. Say, John knows that there's a cup on his desk if and only if John's belief that there's a cup on his desk is produced by some kind of reliable process. What might be a reliable process? It might be his sensory faculties, right? If his sensory faculties, sight or hearing, etc., are reliable in the sense that they produce more true beliefs than false beliefs, so that they in some sense secure and make sure that the belief is true because the process is reliable at getting to truth. It's not a matter of luck. Then John could possess knowledge in these examples. Now, what's important to know, and I will return to it on the slide that discusses internalism and externalism, what's relevant and important here is that this account of knowledge makes factors that are external to somebody really important. What external means is factors beyond our first person purview or consciousness. For instance, from a first person perspective, I'm aware of my beliefs. my desires, my thoughts, but I'm not aware of whether my faculties are functioning properly or not. That's beyond my first-person purview. Whether my sensory faculties are working or not is a kind of external to my first-person consciousness, right? So that's just important. Evidentialism is a kind of justified true belief account, but it just wants to basically tweak the degree of justification required for knowledge. So it basically, if we were saying on the previous slide, justification is to believe on the basis of evidence, then an evidentialist would say that a person knows something only when they have evidence, but that evidence has to be of a sufficiently strong kind, right? Something that can guarantee. Guarantee truth. So for instance, when I believe, say, when I have a belief that I'm happy or I'm in pain, that belief is in some sense what philosophers call incorrigible. I couldn't be mistaken about it. I have that intuitively. I couldn't be wrong about it. There's no way that I could be mistaken about that kind of thing, about my own mental state. So that evidence is really, really strong. So maybe I can know in that kind of case. All right. So that's just an example of two accounts. And I'm coming to you, Daniel. What's really important to know is that both these or any account of knowledge wants to try and give an account where the necessary conditions taken together are sufficient for knowledge, such that fulfilling those conditions guarantees in some sense that the belief we have is true. Yes, Danish.
So in both reliabilism and evidentialism, one of the conditions ought to be that such knowledge is in some sense public and verifiable by other people or other means. Is that what you think?
No, it doesn't have to be. So for instance, I can't verify that I'm in pain to you necessarily. I mean, or suppose I'm thinking of a pink elephant right now. I can't really, we can't prove that, we can't even prove that I'm a conscious agent. You don't have access to my consciousness. But for an evidentialist, I can know that I am conscious or that I'm thinking of a pink elephant or that I'm in pain because the evidence for that I have, that I possess, is sufficiently strong. It's like, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Descartes realized that he can't doubt that he's thinking because whenever he doubts, he's necessarily thinking. The evidence for him thinking in that sense is incorrigible. He could not be mistaken for it. It's sufficiently strong. For a reliabilist, it's just a matter of your belief being produced by a reliable process, one that produces significantly more true beliefs and false beliefs. Right. But don't get too worried about that. The lesson here on this slide is the most important thing. Beyond our recognition of what we mean by belief, truth, I didn't say, but truth is just where some proposition that there's a cup on a desk just corresponds to how the world is, to reality. That's where truth obtains. Justification, I'm saying, is belief based on evidence, but it's not quite like that. I'm going to modify that a bit later. All right, so if that's some of the necessary considerations when we're trying to analyze the nature of knowledge, what about the sources of knowledge? So philosophers, I guess, are for the most part agreed upon what the sources of knowledge are nowadays, although there'll be some that they do have some debate over. So sense perception, sense perception, I meant. What we what we see, what we taste, what we touch, what we smell, what we hear. So our senses enable us to know what's in our external environment, right, primarily. And so that's definitely a source of knowledge. Next, not in the next session, but the one after, we'll be looking at what the Islamic tradition has to say on sources of knowledge. But I think all of these sources you can find within Islamic epistemology too. Al-Hiss, sense perception, is, for instance, reason, aql. We know reason is an important source of knowledge. How is it possible that I know that 1 + 1 is 2? Well, I know it just by rational deduction? How is it that I know that the part of something is necessarily smaller than the whole of something? Again, I can just deduce that rationally. So reason enables us also to make inferences. So we can infer from something. Suppose that I notice that my neighbor's car isn't in their drive, or that all their lights are off. Maybe I'll infer from that they're out, that they're just not in. And so reason enables me to make that inference, to make that move, and then acquire knowledge in that fashion. So reason and sense perception are fundamental. And of course, they work hand in hand, because sense perception gives me the information about the car being out of the drive or the lights being off, and reason allows me to connect the dots. Introspection is where we're looking in, and here we get knowledge about our feelings and thoughts and beliefs and desires and emotions. So that's an integral source of knowledge. And it might be on the basis of that information we acquire from introspection that sends us to the doctors or sends us to the dentist. If your tooth hurts, introspectively, you recognize that. If you're feeling sad, I don't know, maybe you want to book yourself in to see a counselor or whatever the case may be. So introspection is integral. Testimony is another source of knowledge, of course. There's much that we know of the world not on the basis of our first-person direct observations. We know that for many of us, we've not been to China. For instance, somebody tells us that China exists. We believe it on the basis of testimony. We know what happened during the past, basically primarily, on the testimony of written documents or an oral tradition. We know just what happens on a day-to-day basis. Somebody says to you, "Oh yeah, I saw Bob at the supermarket today," and okay, we know that Bob is around the supermarket today based on testimony. If I ask Danish or Ahmed about their childhood and their upbringing, I can potentially get knowledge about those things based on testimony. And if we think about the way that our feelings and so on and thoughts, you don't have access to them. So I have to get them secondhand through your testimony, right? So testimony is integral, obviously. Even within the context of science, scientists don't do every single experiment that there is to be done. And so they rely on the testimony of other scientists to have knowledge with respect to the result of certain experiments or the veracity of certain theories. Memory, of course, is integral as well. What we did yesterday or what we did a minute ago, 5 minutes ago, is key, of course. Again, childhood is an example. Clearly, memory is instrumental to us. If we didn't have memory, we'd lose a lot of things. So memory is important. So sense perception, reason, introspection, testimony, and memory. I think there's a consensus amongst contemporary epistemologists that these are sources of knowledge. The latter two we have here on the right, intuition and DSMS. I just abbreviated these because I wanted to fit them in the box. But DS, I'm meaning divine sense, or what's called a sensus divinitatis. We might call it fitra or something like that. MS would be a moral sense. So I'll come to those. But intuition and reason are sometimes connected, and intuition and our moral sense are sometimes connected. So when I look at the proposition that 1 + 1 is the equivalent of 2, intuitively, I seem to just be able to know that. As soon as I understand the terms in the relevant proposition, intuitively, I just grasp it. I just acquire knowledge. So intuition is related to reason in that sense. Sometimes think of it as rational intuition. But maybe intuition can do more. Maybe intuition is in some sense independent. Maybe intuition can tell us about what's right and wrong. So it also has a relation to a moral sense. So consider the proposition that torturing innocent babies for fun is wrong. When you just understand that proposition, it might be just self-evident to you, on the basis of your faculty of intuition or moral sense, that it is true, that proposition is true, that it is wrong to do that. So intuition is sometimes thought as a source of knowledge. And yeah, intuition is related to DS, divine sense, moral sense too, because it's sometimes thought that we can know intuitively the proposition that God exists is true. We don't necessarily know it by looking at the proposition and just staring at, the proposition that God exists, that God exists, that God exists, as if we're just repeating the proposition. But when we look out into nature, into the world, there might be certain facts such that upon our reflection, when we think about the question whether God exists, it just seems intuitive to us that God exists, right? So these are, I would say, the main important and relevant sources of knowledge. And they're going to be certainly relevant for us when we think about how religious knowledge might be acquired. Just take testimony, for instance. The Quran is the word of Allah, and it is God's testimony, right, in essence, to humankind. So we might know an awful lot about the Akhirah or Yawm al-Qiyamah and what's going to happen just on the basis of testimony. Maybe on the basis of reason, introspection, sense perception, we can't access that. Maybe that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent us his divine testimony to tell us about such things. So yeah, all of these are going to be relevant and important for us as we proceed.
Can I ask something before?
Yeah, of course, Ahmed. Let me go back. Yeah.
So when it comes to intuition, applying it specifically to knowing whether there's a God or whether there's morality,
Right.
Is there anything else outside of that our intuition can let us know, or are there just these two specific things?
Well, I think, the other thing would be self-evident truths of reason, like the proposition that 2 + 2 = 4, or 1 + 1 = 2, or that the whole is greater than the part. So sometimes people would look at that as just being a subsidiary of reason, or others might want to say, well, actually, no, intuition is a sort of faculty in its own right. And maybe reason is just primarily about making inferences. Maybe that's the job of reason. Intuition is a bit different. Yeah.
And all of these sources, like, they give knowledge, but would it be varying degrees of knowledge from each different source?
Yeah. So the thing is, and we're going to get to this, I guess, in a few slides from now. There's not really degrees of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Knowledge, someone either knows something or they don't. But there are degrees of positive epistemic status, right? What that means is that there are certain beliefs that we have, and those beliefs might be appraised in an epistemic way, right? So those beliefs might be reasonable for someone, rational, justified, certain, or knowledge. So we're going to look at that. But I think it's a good point that among these sources, some might be better than others at getting us knowledge, right? So for instance, what I observe directly, first person, is by and large better than what I get secondhand from testimony. And certainly when it comes to introspection, what I can know on the basis of just looking within, obviously trumps getting it secondhand and stuff like that. So, and again, like say intuition, maybe intuition is only good for certain very self-evident propositions. But, when it comes to other debates, so is intuition a reliable faculty to tell a politician whether they should invade another country or not? Probably not, right? So it has its limits and its scope. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ahmed. The last thing I want to say, part one, is the structure of knowledge. So we talked about basically the nature of knowledge, the source of knowledge, the structure of knowledge. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this one, but because I don't want to overcomplicate things. Foundationalism, by the way, at the bottom, is going to be the most important for us, because this view is found within our Islamic tradition. and coherentism and infinitism are not so prevalent. But yeah, basically, if we just for the sake of it, just to make things easy, if we think about knowledge as justified true belief for the moment, right? And we think of justification as having evidence. So in order for me to possess knowledge, I have to have a belief that's true, and I have to have evidence for it, right? So that's fine. So suppose I have a belief that there is a cup on my desk, and my evidence is just the fact that I can see that there is a cup on my desk, right? And that might be enough. But what about do we need to have justification for the evidence itself? What's my justification for thinking that for the perception itself? So some philosophers, but very few, have proposed that you basically, in order for a belief to be justified such that it can be a case of knowledge, you need to have a reason upon which you believe that. And then you need to have another reason upon which you believe, and another reason, ad infinitum. Now, obviously, at face value, that looks ridiculously absurd, because how could we possibly have an actual set of infinite beliefs? But they would normally say that it doesn't have to be actually infinite, but it's potentially infinite, such that if somebody asks you, how do you know something, you're able to give a reason for why you know. And then if they ask you a reason for that, hypothetically, you'd be able to give a reason and a reason and a reason. That is a very obscure and strange view that basically nobody accepts on the nature of the structure of knowledge. Let me just jump down to the bottom. Foundationalism basically says that some beliefs can be items of knowledge for us, and we don't have to have further reasons. We don't have to have additional grounds upon which we justify it. So, for instance, the belief that there is a cup on the desk, is a belief that I hold on the basis of me seeing it. And maybe that's it, right? And so these philosophers who uphold foundationalism basically think there are some special kinds of beliefs that are just foundational, and they're justified in and of themselves. So again, like the 1 + 1 = 2, or I'm feeling or I'm in pain, for instance, there seems to be there's nothing more obvious than just the feeling of pain that I could rely on to justify it. It just seems that is the best justification that we could possibly have. There's nothing else that I could do, right, to give myself additional justification. So it's just foundational. And all of our knowledge, according to a foundationalist, is based on these basic beliefs, they're called. And so we infer from that. So earlier I was talking about the neighbor and the neighbor being out. So we have this belief that there's a car missing in the driveway, right, on the basis of seeing it. And then on the basis of that, we infer that our neighbors are out. And then on the basis of another belief, maybe we infer where exactly they are, right? But we don't need anything extra for the belief that the car's not there. It's just based on seeing it. That's just foundational. And so that's the foundationalism view. And coherentism thinks that, well, for beliefs to be items of knowledge, they need to cohere in a system. So a system itself is basically what's key. So the extent to which some belief coheres with other beliefs makes that system of beliefs by and large more likely to be true. Of course, the problem with that is that coherence just doesn't seem to be a sufficient fit for truth, because you could have a number of beliefs that cohere quite well, and yet the system is just false, right? You could have Greek mythology, all right, maybe it's coherent, but it's still false. So that's just something to note. Don't worry about infinitism and coherentism. Foundationalism, I'm just putting it out there, is the idea that there are some beliefs which are foundational and they don't require extra justification, and we base the rest of our beliefs upon those. We will return to that as we look at religious epistemology in the preceding lectures. All right, so that's part one.
Sorry.
Yeah, Ahmed, please.
Just about coherentism as a topic of interest, wouldn't technically divine sense and moral sense, all the knowledge we gain from those, it's based on coherentism, isn't it?
In what sense?
As in, I believe that this world is very, I don't know, complicated, specifically designed, or anything.
Yeah.
So that coheres with my belief that there is a God.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, you could look at it from the point of view of coherence, but I think what most epistemologists would say, it's not the fact that they're coherent which makes them a piece of knowledge for you. So, for instance, suppose you have this special divine sense that God has given you, and it's really reliable. It's really been set up by God in a very reliable way, such that when you reflect upon nature, you form the belief that God exists. And that faculty, because it's reliable at giving you true beliefs about God, that's what gives you knowledge. It's not the fact that it has to cohere with some other beliefs that is the basis upon which you know, but it's just that it's produced by, say, a truth tracking reliable process. That, for instance, would be a reliabilist account. And so in that sense, your belief would be foundational. You wouldn't need to base it on anything else. You just look into the creation, bang, you form your belief in a foundational way without basing it on an argument or another reason, something like that. So in my opinion, if you're asking my opinion, I don't think coherentism is correct, because I think that we can have beliefs that are foundational. Like believing that for me to believe that I have a cup in my hand, I think it's sufficient that my sensory faculties give me that information and they're working properly. I don't think it matters the extent to which it coheres with another bunch of my beliefs. And I can give maybe an example later about the real issue with coherentism, but I don't want to get too complicated. But okay. Thanks, Ahmed. All right. But we're getting there. So positive epistemic status. So I referred to this. Earlier. And yeah, so positive epistemic status is basically what's called a normative property of a belief, but it's like an evaluative property, if you like. So a belief that we have, any belief that we have, could have some positive status in an epistemic sense. It could be a piece of knowledge for us, could be a true belief, could be a justified belief, could be rational, could be reasonable, could be certain. So there are different kinds of positive epistemic status. And on the basis of what we've been talking about earlier, when we've been thinking about an analysis of knowledge, the suggestion is that you need to have quite a lot of positive epistemic status to get to knowledge. But here are just 5 kinds of positive epistemic status. So certainty would probably be the highest rank of positive epistemic status that we have, although it comes in degrees. So we might, and by the way, this is important to note, certainty is, there's a distinction between psychological certainty and epistemic certainty. So somebody being really convinced that something is true is not what we're talking about here. Someone could have this strong conviction and yet it be irrational, right? Someone could just wishfully believe, in something, that they're going to be a rich man, and they're just so convinced of it, but they have no grounds to believe that epistemically. So that's not what I'm talking about. Epistemic certainty, there are different ways of thinking about it. One way of thinking about it is that, say, the evidence or the grounds upon which one believes something are of such a kind that it's impossible that one is mistaken about the thing they believe. They couldn't be wrong. So one might say, to use the example again, 1 + 1 equals 2, right? That just seems impossible that when we understand the terms that we could be mistaken. Or, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. It seems, impossible that one could be wrong about the fact that they're thinking. Because even to raise that into question, to put that into question, to doubt it, you have to think. It couldn't possibly be wrong. So in this sense, we might have certainty, epistemic certainty, with respect to those propositions, that 1 + 1 = 2, or that I am thinking. Notice, though, and you can probably tell on the basis of the examples, most of the beliefs that we have might not be that of that kind, right? Okay, knowledge. So again, suppose the belief is I had toast for breakfast yesterday. That's the belief. Maybe we can know it, and that's a high kind of epistemic status. It's not certainty, but it's, you know, maybe, and most philosophers these days believe that knowledge in a fallible sense, right? There could be some factor that makes us lose knowledge later on, but that such that the grounds or evidence we have secures our belief as being true, guarantees it in a sufficiently well, but not in the way that certainty does. So knowledge is about knowing that P, whatever that means, because, you know, there are many different accounts. Reliabilism we talked about in Evidentialism. Another kind of positive epistemic status is called warrant, and warrant is defined quite literally as that which turns a true belief into knowledge. So suppose we've got a belief that Danish is wearing glasses, and the belief is true, corresponds with reality because Danish really is wearing glasses. Warrant is whatever else we need to add to true belief to make it such that we can know, right? And it can come in degrees. If we have a sufficient degree of it, we'll get knowledge. If we don't, we won't. It's similar to justification. Sometimes it's synonymous, but other times people want to make a distinction because people want to say that justification is not necessary for knowledge, but what warrant is. So warrant is like that special sauce or ingredient that we add to true belief that gets us knowledge when we have enough of the sauce, let's say. Justification, to be justified, is justification, even the etymology of it, it has roots in deontology. It's to do with being dutiful, right? It has deontic roots. So sometimes people call it deontic justification. So justification is sometimes thought in terms of being epistemically dutiful. So what might be an epistemic duty? To believe only in accordance with the evidence, to consider counter evidence, to be truth-seeking, not to believe something just because we like it or something like that. Those might be some epistemic duties. And providing we're not flouting any of those duties, then, you know, we could have justification. And so that's the view. And rationality is another kind of positive epistemic status. It's fleshed out in different ways, but one way to think about it is just a belief based on evidence. So reasonability or rationality, that a belief is reasonable for me to hold or rational if I have some evidence. What could that be? Well, just my seeing the cup, right? Maybe I haven't been sufficiently epistemically dutiful. Maybe there's some other things that I should have considered in this case. Somebody, whether they slipped something into my drink earlier, and this is a hallucination. But basically, rationality is to believe based on evidence. So, yeah.
Just one little clarification. You said that you might have warrant for something, but no justification. Could you give an example of a case like that?
Well, it would all depend on what we think warrant consists of. So suppose that warrant is like, suppose we're reliabilists about knowledge. And so warrant's achieved when our belief is produced, our true belief is produced by a really reliable process, something that almost always gives us true belief, like say our senses. And suppose that our belief was produced by our senses working reliably, then maybe we could know this glass is in my hand. But maybe I wasn't being necessarily epistemically dutiful in this sense. Maybe I wasn't trying to be truth-seeking or trying to make sure my beliefs based on evidence, or not making sure that I don't believe wishfully, or of trying to just be watertight with the way that I believe. So maybe I lack that kind of justification, deontic justification, but maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe you don't need it. As long as it's produced by some reliable process, maybe that's all you need to know. So, yeah, that would be, I guess, a simple example.
So is it just caution? Is it a psychological property of the agent, or is it more than that?
It's an epistemic property that would subsume on the epistemic activities of the agent. Some of those will be introspective. You could think about whether you've considered all of the relevant counter objections to review or not, for instance.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the final thing to note then, before we move on to the final section, is when we're talking about positive epistemic status, we're not thinking, of course, about positive pragmatic status. Nobody uses this view, by the way, this term. I just made it up, but I'm trying to make a distinction between epistemic and pragmatic. So epistemic status is all about having good grounds, say reliable process, or good reasons, evidence to believe because it's true. But pragmatic reasons or grounds might be about believing something because it's beneficial. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So just note that when we're talking about the grounds or reasons upon which we believe, it's about its relationship to truth. Okay. Yeah, this is the final thing of part 3. I kind of made this distinction, I alluded to it earlier, but when we're thinking about knowledge or warrant or justification, philosophers want to give an account of the necessary conditions that you need to fulfill to get warrant or to get knowledge. And there is a disagreement, a huge disagreement among contemporary epistemologists between whether those grounds that give you warrant or knowledge or justification need to be internally accessible to you, or whether they can be external to you. I'm just looking at it. There's something wrong, completely wrong about this slide, because this is internalism, but the example is externalism, and likewise. So the examples are wrong, but let me just try not to confuse you. I can edit that. But so internalism basically says that the grounds for warrant or that one has must be accessible to your first person consciousness, right? So suppose we believe that Danish is wearing glasses. The grounds for justification or warrant here are immediately accessible to me, because my grounds are my experience of seeing Danish's glasses. I can reflect on that. I have access to that experience. It's accessible to me. But externalism is where the grounds for justification are external to us. So it might be about our faculties functioning properly or working reliably, or us being in the right kind of environment for the workings of our faculties, right? That might be important as well. So those things are external to us. And again, don't worry about it too much, but it will crop up, this distinction between internalism and externalism when it comes to thinking about religious knowledge. Just to give you an example, to use reliabilism, which is externalism, by the way, and evidentialism is generally, well, it is internalism, generally, classical evidentialism. So suppose that we were talking earlier about if we have this intuitive divine faculty, like fitra, something, a fitri, theistic faculty or disposition. So if the achievement of warrant or knowledge includes things external to our first person purview, like the faculty working well in the right kind of environment, then maybe just so long as it is working well, reliably, then I can know things like God exists. But suppose that we think that that's not a good account of knowledge or warrant, and actually what's necessary to know or to have warrant and justification is that the grounds that justify us are accessible to us, that we're aware of relevant pieces of evidence, experiences, or arguments. Well, that might mean that we can't possess justified true belief in God or knowledge of God on the basis of just relying on a faculty that's reliable. No, we need more. We need grounds that are accessible to us. So an argument is immediately accessible to us. I can think about the argument, the proposition, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. I have that accessible to me. That's my justification. And I need that. There are reasons why philosophers think you might need it, reasons why philosophers think you don't need it. We don't need to get into the details right now, but it is relevant. No, this is the final slide of part 3. We can lose our positive epistemic status. How? If we have a defeater. A defeater is just a reason or ground by which one doubts the belief that they hold, right? And you can have two different kinds of defeaters. One is a rebutting defeater and one's an undercutting defeater. So suppose I have a belief that's reasonable for me to hold, and that belief is that, say I'm talking to a farmer in a local village, and I say, and I form the belief that there is a cow in the field, and I do it on the basis of me looking out into the farm, and it seems as though there's a cow. Okay, fine, it's reasonably. But then I say to the farmer, "Oh, isn't that a really huge looking cow you've got there in the field?" And the farmer says, "Oh, no, that's not a cow. That's just a cardboard cutout of a cow that we put there to advertise for the farm." That you have a defeater now for your belief that there is a cow in the field, and it's a rebutting defeater. It counts directly against the truth of your belief. It proves it's false that there is a cow in the field. An undercutting defeater, though, is something that takes away the basis upon which you believe something to be true. Famous example, suppose you're in a factory and there's a conveyor belt with a number of little widgets on this conveyor belt, and they look red, these red widgets. And one of the lieutenants or inspectors of the factory points out that these little widgets on the conveyor belt are being irradiated by infrared light. And so he tells you that. Now that gives you reason to doubt whether the widgets really are red or whether they're just looking red because there's light shining on them. It doesn't prove that it's false that they're red. It doesn't show that they're not red, but it gives you reason to worry about whether they're red. So it undercuts the basis upon which you form your belief. Again, this is really going to be relevant for us in a religious sense, because a rebutting defeater to say belief in God might be like the problem of evil, which tries to show God doesn't exist. An undercutting defeater might be that people say, well, the grounds upon which you believe the existence of God are not reliable. Like, you only believe in God because of wish fulfillment, because you want there to be a God. So that's not truth apt. And if that was the case, it doesn't prove there is no God, but it gives you reason to worry about the grounds upon which you believe in God. Finally, evidence and its kinds. So evidence we can define very simply as just what indicates that something is true. Evidence is just what indicates that something is true. Evidence might be really important for us when we're thinking about knowledge, because some philosophers will say you can only have knowledge when you've got evidence. And it might be really important in a religious context, because some Muslim philosophers or theologians might say you can only be justified or know that God exists when you've got good evidence to believe God exists. Examples of evidence: fingerprints on the murder weapon. Who committed the crime? Was it John, Bob, Bill, whoever? Well, if there's fingerprints on the murder weapon and it's John's fingerprints, it's a good indication it was John. Presence of smoke indicating fire, similar to that fingerprint example. Results of scientific experiments. Maybe you want to assess the conditions under which a certain plant flourishes or grows. You put it in a dark room, you put it in sunlight, you give one a bit of water, you give one not so much water. The result of the experiment indicates what's true with respect to the right conditions for the flourishment of the plant. Arguments can also be evidence. Think of our example about the neighbor being out, right? I look at the driveway, the car is not there, and I argue or infer from that they must be out. That's my evidence. The evidence is my argument. And philosophers sometimes call this propositional evidence because it's evidence on the basis of propositions that we believe and we infer from or to. Non-propositional evidence, though, is not about evidence on the basis of propositions we think about and infer from, but it's like our experiences. So I have a non-propositional evidence that there's a cup. I just have it just seems to me that there is a cup. I have this experience that there's a cup, right? Really important for us are these two arguments and say propositional evidence, non-propositional evidence. Muslim theologians made a great deal about propositional evidence. There are different kinds of propositional evidence, or as we might just say, different kinds of argument. There are deductive, inductive, and abductive arguments, among others. A deductive argument makes the conclusion necessarily true if the premises are true. For instance, if it's raining, then the ground outside will be wet. It is raining, therefore the ground outside is wet. If 1 and 2 are true, necessarily 3 is true. An inductive argument, on the other hand, is basically works by looking at a sample set and making a generalization on the basis of the sample. Suppose there's a spelling mistake here. Suppose I observed, not overserved. I observed 1,000 white swans in Wales over X period of time. And then I conclude, therefore, probably most swans in Wales are white, right? That is based on an inductive sample that we have, and we make an inference. Abductive is where we're trying to reach the best explanation of some phenomena. For instance, suppose we observe there are footprints in the sand. We conclude, therefore, someone must have walked here. It's not the only explanation. Maybe the sun shone and the wind blew and the footprints just came together, or maybe someone was, I don't know, maybe it was an animal that has sufficiently large paws or something. So in an abductive situation, we basically infer to the best explanation. And this is very important, particularly for the final lecture of this course. And so I'm going to say something about that now, and then we will end. So this is going to crop up and it's going to be relevant for us when we think about God or Islamic theism as a hypothesis that we propose to explain certain phenomena. So just consider the following 1 to 4. Data En, E is just a piece of data, N could be any number of the pieces. You want E 1, 2, 3, however many. Data En has been observed. Let's just, for argument's sake, say that it's a crime, a murder taking place, right? And there's missing, and let's say it's a murder and a theft. So we've got this missing money from the wallet, and that money is found in someone's wallet. We've got fingerprints on the weapon. We've got CCTV footage. So we've got different bits of data that have been observed. The set of hypotheses, should say hypotheses, HM explain EN. So our hypotheses are John, Bob, Bill, Harry, right? We've got John did it, Bob did it, Harry did it, Bill did it. They're our hypotheses. And we propose them to explain the data. H1 being that John did it is the best explanation amongst those hypotheses that explain the data. So it's likely that H1 is true. So that is basically an abductive inference where you have a hypothesis. How do we go about confirming the hypothesis? Well, we need to look at the evidence, and we need to look at the extent to which the hypothesis can be confirmed by the evidence. Now, there are different ways to do that. When we're thinking about hypotheses, there are certain criteria that we might want to look at to assess the extent to which it explains the phenomena. So the power, like how well does it work as an explanation, right? So, for instance, the explanatory power of the hypothesis that it's John, when we're looking at the fingerprints on the murder weapon being John's, that's a powerful explanation. It explains really well those fingerprints being on the murder weapon, that it being John, right? Scope, how much can it explain? It explains the fingerprints. It explains maybe the CCTV footage. It explains the theft as well. Maybe the money's in John's wallet. So it explains the whole range. And its simplicity, an explanation which says, oh, well, no, what actually happened is that somebody framed John and then put John's gloves on and then touched the murder weapon and then went into John's apartment and put the money. There's all this unnecessary complication makes it unlikely, because there are more ways it can go wrong. The more complicated a hypothesis, there are more ways that it can go wrong. So simplicity is important. And then there are other key considerations beyond the criteria, like what's the prior probability of the hypothesis before looking at the evidence. Suppose John is a known criminal, a crook, a liar. He's got a bad track record. There's a high prior probability that it's John, relative to, say, Bob, Bill, or whoever. And what's the prior probability of the evidence turning up independent of the hypothesis that John did it? So the prior probability of this evidence of there being fingerprints, that are John's on the murder weapon, that the money being in John's wallet, seems to be low without invoking the hypothesis that John did it. So those are some considerations that we will have to look at when we think about the epistemic status of Islamic theism. And so that's all for today. I know that I've gone through quite a lot, and it might have been somewhat unduly complicated, and I hope it's not. But these tools...
Absolutely not. I think this was really helpful and a very good overview, and also allows us the building blocks on which some of the next lectures in the series will be based upon. Okay, thank you, Jamie, for that excellent talk. There was a lot of material packed into short span of 50 minutes, and I think it's going to be really helpful as we proceed in this series of lectures. The first question I would like to ask you is from the perspective of, let's say, a skeptic of this whole exercise, this whole intellectual exercise. And I'm not asking from the perspective of a fideist, but rather from the perspective of an indifferentist, somebody who's indifferent to all philosophical inquiry on this question. And they might say that, what's the point of this sort of an inquiry, apart from it being an ivory tower exercise? Does it really help believers to engage in this kind of exercise? Might it be a waste of their time? So what would you say to that? And you can take this in any way you like.
Yeah, I suppose it's a good question. I mean, first of all, if somebody was to assert the proposition that this is all of a waste of time, for us to take that seriously, they would have to give us some reason or evidence. And so they'd just be playing into...
They fall into a performative contradiction.
Yeah, I think so. So it's very difficult to kind of get out of it. I mean, I remember a while ago there was some lecture, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf was saying, if you're not philosophizing, somebody's philosophizing for you. And so it's kind of inescapable. But I think in the context of our discussion, obviously, we have been talking about rather highbrow stuff and concepts. But, the purpose of the course is to just get Muslim students in Islamic studies, theology, etc., or other fields of discipline.
Just curious Muslim minds generally.
Yeah. Sorry, you broke up a bit there, but for curious Muslim minds in general, exactly. And I think that we're at a period of time when religious belief is in question, just politically, socially, and philosophically. And so I think we need to acquire the tools to explicate our tradition in a robust intellectual fashion. And so we won't be able to do that sufficiently well if we're not familiar with these relevant philosophical tools and concepts to do that. So I think it serves a purpose for those curious Muslim minds.
Excellent answer. So a second question that I would like to ask you is slightly similar, but comes from a different tangent or from a different perspective, which is somebody might accuse us of parochialism. They might say that all I've been hearing about is an inquiry into propositional knowledge. There are other forms of knowing. There's knowledge by acquaintance. There's knowledge by religious experience, especially in the context of Islamic theism. Most people are believers because they were born in a Muslim household and they never thought about it. And they are good Muslims. Then there are people who feel deeply in worship and they recognize the presence of God. So what would we say to those people that propositional knowledge is inevitably a question that they might have to confront? Or is this irrelevant for them?
Well, I mean, look, I think, first of all, you made a distinction there between propositional knowledge and knowledge by acquaintance, which are not necessarily distinct in that knowledge by acquaintance is still ultimately going to be knowledge with respect to some proposition. But in terms of, your average Muslim or your ordinary Muslim, it's perfectly fine for them, in theory, in principle, to ignore this stuff and to engage in worship and knowledge of the Islamic tradition. And I don't have a knockdown objection to it. But what I would say is that for many of us, in the contemporary context in which we're living, questions concerning the rationality, the knowability, the justification of theistic belief and Islamic theistic belief is something that's been brought into question, not necessarily by us, but by others in our society. And so I think it's important for us to have a dialogue with such individuals in our society in a smart intellectual fashion. Yes. So
I said I had said that for people who believe in religious experience, they might think that this is still parochial because propositional knowledge is anyway not relevant.
Well, I mean, religious experience would just be a means to acquire propositional knowledge. The evidence that one has that supports will be not, the evidence is non-propositional, right? It's just an experience, but that experience supports a proposition, right? So the evidence is non-propositional, but the belief is propositional. The belief that God exists is a proposition just by definition, right? So if somebody has a religious experience, maybe that experience is sufficient for them to have reasonable, rational belief in God, but it would still be a kind of proposition knowledge. I think what you're really asking is, do Muslims who believe in Islam and God through their basic experiences need to engage in epistemology and philosophy? Maybe is that what you're getting at? Or
kind of, but also what you had alluded to in the beginning, which was that for people who are, let's say, not so psyched about propositional evidence, they might think that non-propositional evidence is actually more valuable. Or
yeah, I mean, I think that non-propositional evidence might be more valuable in one sense, in that maybe that's the kind of evidence that is really going to clinch it for somebody, or it's even going to clinch it from the point of view of justification. So I don't actually necessarily disagree with that, but I think what we're engaging in here is more of a meta discussion beyond, like we're moving beyond just accepting our experiences, and we're thinking about what those experiences mean, what those experiences can do for us, and asking questions about how can we be justified in believing God, and what role might experiences play. Now, that might not be so important for the ordinary person, but it will be important for somebody who is in the contemporary world and engaged in a society in which those beliefs are thrown into question, for instance.
In any case, religious experience also has to be interpreted in some way. So
that's also partly true, and that is true, and part of the issue. And I guess, look, I mean, even as Muslims who believe in a tradition, we want to be able to understand our tradition, right? And an aspect of our tradition is its epistemological aspect, right? How can we know the things that our religion teaches us? How can we know them to be true? And what do we need to possess true iman, for instance, or something like that? These are epistemological questions. So even any student of knowledge, a curious Muslim mind, I think should take these questions, epistemological questions, seriously.
Okay, so the next question is more methodological and also biographical.
Yeah.
The enterprise of inquiry into these kinds of questions has been a medieval enterprise, in the sense that it was in the medieval times that Muslim thinkers, Ash'arites, Maturidis, and others engaged in questions of evidence of God and whether you have to believe on those bases or not.
Yeah.
And what you gave us a presentation of today included vocabulary which is very contemporary. Mm-hmm. So how do you bridge the gap between the two? You seem to be at the forefront of a group of scholars who managed to somehow translate those ideas into a vocabulary which is contemporary. What are the pitfalls of doing such an exercise, do you think? And do you think this sort of an exercise is important and more Muslims should do, more Muslim scholars should engage in this?
Yeah, so I think that the word that you use, translate, is an operative one there. I mean, that would be part of the project that I see myself and others engaged in. I would also see it as having a more constructive component than just translation too. But yeah, I mean, look, we as contemporary people, we're engaging in dialogue, in discussions, in intellectual debate, and so on. And in doing so, we adopt a certain language. And we need to speak the same language to communicate with one another or to understand one another. So, we're not living in the medieval period anymore. And intellectually, things have moved on, at least in philosophy. So I think it's important for Muslims to be able to engage in a dialogue in the language of contemporary philosophy, such that we can communicate with our fellow intellectuals in the world today. The pitfalls, I mean, there is a risk of distortion, right? That's clear in any translation, just a simple translation of a text. Are you distorting the meaning? Are you changing it significantly? So, for instance, if we think it's important and valuable to take our medieval tradition seriously, we don't want to be distorting that tradition. So that's, I guess, a potential pitfall. But what I would say is that there's probably a scope of translation or interpretation. So basically, what I would say is that there are certain things within our tradition which are foundational with respect to our aqidah and within usul ad-din and so on, which are just fixed, period, and we just got to stick with what the medieval tradition is saying. But there are other things, such as religious epistemology, which I think we can look at the medieval tradition and we can grasp the basic intuition that these theologians are getting at, and then try and translate and then develop that basic intuition on the basis of thinking about the relevant theologian or theological tradition. So I see it when we're looking at our medieval tradition with respect to, say, religious epistemological questions, we're trying to zoom in on the basic intuition that they're getting at, and then translate and construct and explicate on the basis of homing in on that intuition.
Excellent. So another question that I would like to ask you, and this is also from the perspective of somebody who's on the margins, or rather on the outside, who's not really a philosophy student or a philosophy thinker or theology student. They might have a question or a doubt about the tyranny of theory. What I mean by that is there happens to be a lot of either or in the kinds of options that we are given in studying these questions. So, for instance, internalism versus externalism, or for instance, fideism versus evidentialism. Whereas in their experience, or in our experience, there is sometimes a bit of both. There's no either or. And how we decide to do certain things or believe in certain things happens to have an eclectic mix of how decision-making procedures, or a decision-making procedure which has an eclectic mix of factors. So what would you say to a concern like that?
I mean, that concern would only obviously occur within this context if we are being overly binary in our thinking. So, if we are setting up these dichotomies, not necessarily arbitrarily, but in a kind of overly restrictive fashion, and so we're kind of narrowing down the possibilities, that would be problematic. But I don't think that that is a necessary feature of the inquiry that we're engaged in. I mean, we're engaging in an epistemological inquiry, and we should be relatively open-minded, at least in terms of trying to understand the various options and positions that are at play. So I guess if it is a concern, we can guard against it. So I don't see that as an in principle, say, objection to the inquiry, because, I mean, there's nothing about this inquiry that means it must be more binary than any other inquiry, right? You might find binaries when you're thinking about FIP or something like that. Should we not engage in FIP? I mean, I think it's more of a mindset than it is a problem of the inquiry itself, maybe.
Yeah. But I was also thinking of something like on the question of, let's say, whether a foundationalist approach is more in keeping with, let's say, approaching a question like this, or a coherentist approach, something which Ahmed brought up. There might be some particular view which might incorporate the best of both those methods, and might be called something like a founder or something. Yeah, I mean, because that's an option in every epistemology.
There is a view. I mean, I was very brief there, but the view is called found-herentism. So that exists already in the literature. William Alston, for instance, developed what he called an internalist-externalist view. So there are these attempts as well. And
knowing all of this material will actually help you to overcome concerns like the tyranny of theory, because you might say that dissolves, that sort of objection dissolves itself.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah. So now I would like to come to something specific. So on the question of abductive argument, this might be new to a lot of thinkers, a lot of our listeners. Could you say something more about abduction? Is it merely hypothesis? Is it merely like a call to look for more evidence, or is it something different?
So abduction basically goes by another name, which is inference to the best explanation, or IBE, in the literature. So an abducted inference, or an inference to the best explanation, is where you observe some phenomena or set of phenomena, some phenomenon or set of phenomena, and they are your pieces of data. Then you reflect on what best explains the phenomena or the data. And so you propose a number of potential explanations. One might want to call that a hypothesis or hypotheses. And then you engage in an analysis as to which is the most likely explanation of the data in question. So that's what I mean. And of course, this is integral to science, for instance, or even history or other fields of inquiry. If a historian is analyzing certain artifacts or an archaeologist is analyzing certain artifacts that they find, there are a number of potential explanations that they can come up with that explain how these artifacts came to be or why they're there. In science, a scientist observes some data and then does experiments, proposes hypotheses and does experiments to try and find out which is the best explanation. So yeah, I think that we can apply a similar model when we start thinking about religious epistemology, Islamic epistemology as well.
So as an example of an abductive inference, would you say that something like William Paley's argument when he observed a clock as opposed to a rock lying, is that an abductive sort of reasoning, or is that different? Am I misunderstanding something?
No, I think that, say, William Paley's argument is, it depends how you flesh it out, but often in the literature it's considered to be an argument from analogy.
Right.
So basically what William Paley's doing is he's making an analogy between a pocket watch and the human biological machine, or like the eye, for instance.
Right.
So he's looking at these two things and he thinks they're analogous in some important way, that they both complex, they're both they have some inherent teleology, or they're both regular in how they operate. And the analogy is that, you know, if you say one's designed, then analogously you've got to say the other as well. So I don't think what Paley did is set up a number of competing explanations for appearances of design, but you could run a design argument that basically takes a certain phenomena. And so, for instance, the fine-tuning design argument, you know, that certain laws or physical constants of the universe and initial conditions seem to be just right to allow life to exist in the universe. That argument is typically abductive, in that it has, okay, chance, multiverse, physical necessity, God, designer. And then it goes that way. So that would be an example in natural theology where, you know, the abducted inference is at work. But I think what we're going to find later on, particularly the final lecture, is that it's relevant when we take an assessment of a wide range of phenomena, which include phenomena concerning the Prophet, the Quran, and different things, and we consider Islamic theism, naturalism, Christian theism, and these competing explanatory hypotheses. And these would be world hypotheses that try to explain the nature of reality itself.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, Jamie, this was excellent. I would like you to at least run through our listeners, our viewers, with coming attractions. What is going to come in the future? And could you just lay out a little bit of what you're going to cover in the next few weeks?
Yeah, so over the next few weeks, on the basis of today's session, obviously here we've tried to gather up certain tools, conceptual tools that are going to help us to proceed. So next, the lecture, we're going to be looking at religious epistemology. So we're going to take some of the tools that we've learned and then apply those to thinking about religious epistemology, questions concerning how we might know God, how it might be reasonable to believe in God, and so on. And then that will include different positions within the context of answering those questions. And then from there, we'll look at specifically the Islamic tradition. So we're looking at Islamic religious epistemology. So how does our tradition answer these religious epistemological questions? And again, the tools that we get from just looking at religious epistemology in general will help us when we're thinking about our tradition as well. And then we'll try to explore in more depth certain areas within the tradition, and then raise the broad epistemic question about Islamic theism, how we might know Islamic theism to be true, and the like.
Excellent. So I think this should be attractive to a lot of our listeners, and I hope that they will tune in as and when some of these lectures are uploaded on our YouTube channel. Jamie Turner, it was a pleasure listening to you, and thank you for being with us today.
It was a pleasure to be on.